Hey guys, today we take a look at some major pre-Columbian civilizations in the Americas. So when we say pre-Columbian, we just mean civilizations that existed in the Americas before the arrival of Christopher Columbus and other Europeans. So in your partial notes, just underneath conquistadors, you can see where it says major pre-Columbian civilizations in the Americas. Um, you have probably noticed that three different civilizations are identified in your map. We have the Aztecs and the Mayas in Central America, and then we have the Inca Empire down in South America. So we're going to take a look at these three civilizations and learn about what life was like in these civilizations, how developed they were, how big they were, and how advanced their technologies were. So let's get into it. So let's start off with the Mayans, also known as the Mayas. Sometimes you see the letter N in there, sometimes you don't. Okay, so where did the Mayas live? They were in the Yucatan Peninsula, which is in South America, just along the Gulf of Mexico. Or sorry, not South America, uh, Central America. Okay, so take a look at this pyramid. If you were to go down to the Yucatan Peninsula, you would be able to come across all sorts of really cool Mayan ruins. And this is one Mayan ruin that people can visit, and it is Chichen Itza. There's a pyramid in Chichen Itza, and it's known as El Castillo, like castle, and it was part of one of the largest Maya cities. Okay, so along the edges of the pyramid, you'll see that they've decorated it to look like this serpent god, which is pretty cool. There are other statues of the serpent god as well. And here's an observatory, right? So these are sort of these towers that people could go up into to observe the stars, because the Mayas were really interested in trying to understand the movement of the stars, the movement of planets, and movement of moons. So they were really into astronomy. So here, you can see that this word here is written in red, the word astronomy. What I want you to do is go to your map here, and you see it says Maya. So we're studying the Mayas right now. Maybe just draw like a little arrow and then write a few words, in small letters. We're just going to identify a few words that really describe the civilizations of the Americas. Okay, so you can write the word astronomy somewhere near the Mayas. Okay, and so they were really into astronomy. They had put together this Mayan calendar. Right, Mayan calendar, you may have heard of it. It's quite famous, and it was used to predict all sorts of things, like including eclipses, and they were able to predict those very reliably. Okay, so here is a game that was played by the Mayas. It was this type of ball game, and this was the court. So you can see the ruins of an ancient Mayan ball court. And so they would use this really heavy 9-pound ball, like that's so heavy, and they have to keep the ball in play, sort of hitting the ball with their hips. And at times, on some occasions, the game would involve human sacrifice, so the losing team might be sacrificed. Okay, so here are some more ruins. You can see that in many parts of what used to be the Mayan Empire, the forest has reclaimed the ruins, but then the forest has now been cleared out so that people can visit these ruins. All right, you can write down the word maze. Right, so like you learned in Jared Diamond's video, all great civilizations of history were they were able to develop in the way they did because they had access to productive plants. And the Mayas, they had access to maize, which is another way of saying corn. Okay, so corn was an essential ingredient for their empire, right? So they were farmers. So they, like many other groups of people, made the transition from hunter-gatherers to farmers, and they were able to develop their empire based on the farming of maize, corn. And so corn is a pretty good plant because with corn you are able to store it for pretty long periods of time. It's fairly nutritious as well. And so you can see that they had some granaries, some underground granaries in order to store their corn so that they could use it again in the future. Okay, here's some more ruins, the city of Tikal this time. So the city of Tikal had this temple of the masks, and this was the temple that the emperor of the Mayan Empire emperor had built for his wife. Okay, so no matter what you do for your boyfriend or girlfriend for Valentine's Day, it's probably never going to be as good as what the emperor built for his wife here. All right, he built a temple. So the Mayas were advanced in some ways. You guys can write down the red words here, the Maya script. So the Mayas, they had a script, which is an early form of writing. And so you can see that different pictures represented different things. And they also had a numeral system, right? So they were working on representing numbers with images, right? So you can see here we have this is supposed to be a turtle shell, right? And then here's the number 1, and then here's the number 5. And so you stack up, 3 5s and 3 dots. Well, then that makes 18, okay? So it's kind of cool. You can see some Mayan glyphs written on this wall, right? So they're very detailed. You can see that they would take a long time to make. And then here's the numbering system again. Okay, their architecture included arches, which is a big deal. That's a sign of an advanced architecture system. Okay, and they had chocolate. Woo! So in the Americas, they had chocolate, but they did not have sugar. Right, so their chocolate was a little bit different. They used to drink chocolate mixed with spices, so it was more like a spicy chocolate instead of a sweet chocolate. Okay, let's move on to the Aztecs. All right, so the Aztecs, you are looking at your partial notes. Here are the Aztecs right here. So you can write a few things about the Aztecs to the left here, or to the west of the Aztec Empire. Okay, so there we go. Here are the Aztecs right there in what is now Mexico. All right, you can write down the name of this city. All right, I'm probably gonna pronounce it wrong, Tenochtitlan. All right, I'm only gonna say it once. So this was a super cool city, very, very cool city. There was a lot of water in this city. They had a whole network of little canals that they used for irrigating their corn. And so we see the ruins of the city center are still there today, so you can still go visit them. This is obviously an artistic depiction of what they think the city might have looked like. So you see that it was a pretty cool place. They had what were called floating gardens. Okay, you can write down the red words. So the floating gardens, this was how the corn was set up in rows, but in between the rows of corn, there'd be water. And that water, of course, would irrigate the corn. And take a look at this other artistic depiction of what they think the city looked like. All right, looks pretty darn cool. All right, so when Europeans first arrived, it was Hernan Cortez who arrived in the Aztec Empire, and they were absolutely blown away by this city. It was an enormous city. There were so many people who were living there. It was so clean, right? The cities of Europe at the time were pretty gross and very, very dirty. However, they found that this city was extremely clean, and they often called it the Venice of the Americas. Okay, so here we have Aztec writing. They also had their own system of writing. You can see that it's a system that is, use the use of pictures. So it's like pictographic, and it's ideographic, meaning that they have different pictures that pick different ideas. And they also had a numeral system in the Aztec Empire as well, right? So you can see that each of these dots represents 1, right? So all the way up to the number 20. And then when you get to the number 20, then it would be a sheaf. And then those would add up all the way to 400. And when you get to 400, well, then it becomes this, what do you call this? This long thing with hairs on it, right? So as if to symbolize, like, there's a lot of hairs on your head, all right, like 400. And then you could stack these up until you get to 8,000. Then 8,000 would be this sack of, like a sack of cocoa, and how there'd be so many different little grains of cocoa in there. Okay. So the Aztecs were fierce warriors. That's one thing that they were really known for. They were scary. They had really scary warriors. They really intimidated other groups of people in Central America. One thing they did is they would sacrifice members of neighboring tribes to the sun god, right? So you have this this myth of them ripping out the hearts of their victims up on their pyramids, right? So they had these pyramids, and they would sacrifice people up on their pyramids. And there are lots of different theories on why they did this, right? There are some religious theories, there are some political theories, there are some psychological theories, ecological theories, dietary theories. If you want, you can read through that if you're curious, and you want to know why this is something they did. Yeah, they definitely intimidated their opponents in a very serious way. I know I would be intimidated if I came across the Aztec Empire. They used to um, show off all the skulls of their opponents that they had killed on the wall of skulls. And they had a lot of gold. That's important for this story. You guys can write down the word gold because conquistadors, they were looking for gold, among other things. But one thing that they were very, very interested in was gold. And the Aztecs had gold. And so the conquistadors were interested in conquering the Aztecs. And lastly, we have the Incas. So the Incas, this was the empire in South America. It was the biggest empire of the three. It was quite huge. And the city was the city of Cusco. Okay, so if I don't know if any of you saw this movie, it's a pretty old movie, I guess, called The Emperor's New Groove. And there was the llama, who is the main character, and he's the emperor, and his name is Cusco. That's supposed to, have to do with the Inca Empire. Okay, so the city of Cusco is still a city today, and it's a really cool city. They use a lot of stone masonry, or at least they did use a lot of stone masonry back in the days of the Inca Empire. And so you can see how these stones are stacked up so nicely on top of each other. They're not using grout, right? Often we use grout when we're combining things like stones, but they would just place one stone on top of the other, and they could find stones that fit perfectly on each other. And of course, they would carve away at them to make them fit. But like, take a look at the stone here. Look at all the different sides to it, like side here. Like, it's pretty amazing stone, and how they managed to build these massive walls that are still there today. They're super solid still. So you can write down the words Machu Picchu. Machu Picchu is this lost city of the Incas. So the Incas had built this city up on the mountain in the jungle, which was really cool. And it was discovered first by a guy called Norman Hunje with his wife. No, I'm just kidding. That is a picture of me and my wife. We went to Machu Picchu many years ago, and it's really, really a cool place. If you ever get the chance to go, I definitely recommend it. You can hike to it. You got to hike through the jungle for a few days, and then you hike up the mountain, and then you get to see this super, super cool city. You can see down there, it's all stone walls. They had a really cool irrigation system where when it would rain, the rainwater would be dispersed through the city, and there'd be like these little water channels that would go by people's houses so they could scoop up water. And it's a lot of rocks, right? And so when people would visit the city, they would be asked to bring some rocks. And bring a rock. If you're going to come visit the city, bring us a rock, and we can add it to the city, which is pretty cool. So the Incas, they were a really spread out civilization. And so they had this network of trails called the Inca Trail. And there were a lot of rivers that needed to be crossed. And so they used a lot of suspension bridges, which is a really cool innovation in order to cross over these rivers, right? So here is the Inca Trail. The Inca Trail is quite intense. I took these photos actually, and here are some parts of the Inca Trail, right? You can see that it was pretty dangerous to walk along this trail, and there were these people who would deliver messages from one city to the next. And so they would just run. They would run from one city to the other, sometimes running for hours and hours and hours. And it's pretty impressive, right? Especially considering the fact that these trails were so dangerous. I mean, look at some of these parts of these trails. Okay, so the Incas, they were really good farmers. So they did something called terrace farming, which also took place in other parts of the world too, like including in Asia. And so this terrace farming allowed them to carve into the mountains to make flatlands where they would grow things like potatoes. and they would use digging sticks, right? So this is the Americas, right? In the Americas, they did not have metal tools. And so they used these digging sticks to dig in to the soil, and then they could put the seeds into the soil and close it up. An important part of Inca spirituality and religion was the sun, right? So there was Inti, which was the name for the sun god. And the son of the sun, his name was Atahualpa, and he was the Inca, right? So he was the emperor of the Inca Empire, and he was known as sort of a like a half god and half human, or fully god and fully human. Um, and so he was worshipped as a god, and he also was the one who ran their entire empire. Okay. Gold and pottery was important in the Inca Empire. So here we have some pottery depicting corn, depicting maize, and potatoes were really important, right? So they had cultivated over 100 different types of potatoes, right? So they would grow all these different types of potatoes at different altitudes. They did a lot of agricultural research, testing out different varieties of potatoes at different altitudes to see which ones would grow best, and they really figured it out. Okay, so here's some produce you could get from a typical Incan market, right? So you see so many different potatoes, you see carrots, you see a lot of like root vegetables, right? But also tomatoes and peppers, right? That looks awesome, right? And they did a lot of ceramic work, right? So you can see some jars that they made depicting different foods, right? And very importantly for this story is their use of gold and silver. There was a lot of gold, there was a lot of silver in the Inca Empire. Okay, and so when the conquistadors arrived, they thought, hey, we like the looks of all that gold and silver, right? And so the famous conquistador who went down to South America was named Francisco Pizarro. And here he is on the left side of the screen, right? And so he traveled down with a small group of conquistadors on their horses, and they had their weapons with them. And they faced off against Atahualpa. So they met Atahualpa, and well, I'm not going to spoil anything. All right, I don't want to give away the ending, although you could probably guess what happened. And we're going to be watching a video in the next lesson here, where you see what happened, right, when the two encountered each other and fighting ensued. What did the fighting look like, and who was given very many advantages in the situation, and why? Okay, so once you're done this video, you can be watching the Guns, Germs, and Steel Part 2. All right, so Part 2 is going to tell you all about Pizarro versus Atahualpa. Okay, so there we have it. That's it. That's all. Have a good day.